And in terms of an ethics panel, do you think that you respond with this sort of moral panic? Yes, thank you, Fiona. I mean, is there a sense of panic when you look at any research that involves social media? And do you think you take a very conservative approach, which I think, again, is something that Fiona identified as perhaps being one of the issues that we have of HREC panels?
I'd look at the particular application. I'd like to understand the relationship between the researcher and Twitter or Facebook, to understand the legal relationship. I'd like to understand what intellectual property the researcher would like to derive out of the research, and I'd like to understand whether or not the interaction with Facebook, for example, allows that. I'd also like to understand in the particular project, the relationship with the participant, and whether the participant is identified, whether there's any follow-up, as mentioned by the last speaker, and whether or not there's been consent to that particular aspect. So I'd certainly view it case by case. The fact that it was social media wouldn't create a concern for me.
What I find is that because a lot of the issues we haven't had to deal with before, there aren't any rules, so we're kind of very much feeling our way. Another issue, I think, is that a lot of people on the committee are not familiar enough with social media to really understand the implications of the different options and methodologies and things, and for that reason, you almost need an expert that is as knowledgeable as our speakers today to really add that detail and the context given the specifics of the particular project. So I wouldn't say that it's panic as much as a fair bit of confusion and a degree of ignorance, I guess, in terms of the technicalities of these new platforms.
I don't know about moral panic. I think it's technological panic in my case. It's I think a similar point. You're not really knowing some of these things, but I don't let that worry me too much. Just hope that other members of the committee have got something to contribute there.
I think likewise. I think our committee is very good at asking the questions, and so they accept that they don't know everything, and they ask the researcher to explain. And they're pretty much questions that you would get in any research project. They're around the principles in the national statement. So those questions about privacy and ownership and, what right do you have to be in that space, they send that back to the researcher, and then they start the dialogue around that.
Yeah, similarly, I don't think panic's the right way to describe the response. A lot of it is that sometimes the research comes across as being an opportunity for a bit of a free-for-all. It's like kids in the lolly shop, and there's all this data, and it's out there, and it's in the public domain, so we can just use it. So it's the standard questions relating to the national statement that sometimes I think that the onus is on the researchers to be responsible and outline how their research has integrity against those principles. The other thing is that social media is a tool. It's not the answer, it's a tool. And it needs to be considered as a tool. And so sometimes, it's a bit like, don't be... Sometimes I think the research is a little bit swayed by the sexy nature of the tool rather than what's the nature of the research question.
The National Centre for Research in the UK did a study looking at what do people find as appropriate use of their social media data, and they came up with this really neat sort of diagram and triangle of sort of the hierarchy of responsibility, and they found that most people were quite happy for their data to be used for good, for common good, but I don't know what fits as good, and that things like Facebook required a very high level of consent, where things like Twitter, virtually you didn't need consent at all. The only problem with this study was the focus group of about 40 people. So it would have been really nice if we'd seen an update to something like that, because I actually think there's a hierarchy of social media and people are certainly happy for certain things to be used for certain purposes. But then again, that still requires some level of informed consent. So, yeah.
I think one of the problems that researchers have is that the default position for ethics committees is to go back to the legal. What are the terms and conditions? What have people signed up for? And what do researchers actually have to do to get access? The Facebook study that I actually talked about was legal. It is completely legal for Facebook to do that. So Facebook is entirely able to manipulate that data and to change people's emotional statements. That doesn't make it ethical. And this is the problem that we face, because it's all very well for us to keep on going back to the national statement and come back to things around privacy. Great, privacy, what is privacy? Now, we do have a hierarchy. It ranges from anonymous to anonymous. Anonymous are named sites, so that's dating sites, for example, but also Facebook, where who you are online is directly related to a physical person. But we range all the way through to that to completely anonymous sites. The question then comes at the point of how real is an anonymous person? How much protection does an avatar, a pseudonym on a forum have? What levels of privacy do we believe as ethics committees we should have? And the national statement doesn't actually deal with that. It doesn't deal with issues around privacy of people who are completely made up. It doesn't deal with issues of privacy about someone who's playing Call of Duty and the interactions which go on there. And what we actually know about online games is Gamergate, where there's a vast mess of racist and sexist and horrible stuff going on, which needs to be unpacked and picked apart. But the national statement doesn't guide us in terms of managing those sorts of identities.
We can still link it back to the questions of research integrity. So if the research questions are such that accessing like the chat rooms in games and so looking at the sorts of comments, and this is not my milieu, so if I'm using the wrong phrases here, then I think as ethics committees, we're pretty good at not one size fits all. So it's how do we find those balances between consent, privacy and research integrity. And I think Bridie's point about there is no social media. There are a whole lot of social media, plural, and understanding the different ways in which each of those platforms facilitate privacy, consent, and research questions.
None of them are designed to do that.
And none of them are designed to do that. And as you point, and my work background, I'm currently a farmer, so hey, but my work background is in the public service, and as with corporations, government departments, unless you're Department of Health, aren't required to get ethics consent. So it just depends on people behaving well instead of people behaving badly.